Alrighty, so I think we're at the end of 3 days worth of festivities here. I want to take a little bit of time to reflect at this point on what it was like to be a Confucian disciple of Mozi, member of Lord Shang's ideal society, and talk about what the key learnings have been, as well as how we think that the application of these different philosophies can be relevant to developing meaning and purpose in the life of a young person. So to kick it off, I think we'll start with a day in the life of a Confucian disciple and what we learned. There's a quote that I think is really relevant to why we're doing this reflection, which is, if you learn without thinking about what you have learned, you'll be lost. And this is from Confucius. I think what it says, in effect, is that we have to look back on these experiences and now really let the learning begin.
Yeah, and to just start off like our Confucius day, we started it with just waking up early and exercising, so having a very set routine of what we wanted to do. And I think it was pretty enlightening because, like, one, you have to get up like super early, and then two, like, you have to stick to the routine and be disciplined in your mind. So I think that really helped with playing into the self-cultivation that we wanted to do. I mean, for me personally, it was pretty nice to like wake up early, get stuff done, and then actually have like your whole entire day like still ready for you to tackle. I don't know, you want to talk more about how you felt?
I mean, I feel like something I think it connects back to is kind of this idea of what ritual and self-cultivation actually look like. And for me personally, what I found is that a lot of my instincts were not necessarily leading me in the right direction as far as what the way would be telling me to do or what Confucius would be instructing me to do. So my instinct said stay in bed. My instinct said cut the workout early. My instinct said don't call your parents. And these were not necessarily the right things to do. So I really did feel like the guideposts of routine really helped a lot with self-cultivation.
Yeah, and then we can move on to when we called our parents. I think we had very, very different experiences. I don't know if you want to speak more about yours first.
Yeah. So if you remember, when I called my mom, she sort of talked about conflict she was having with my grandparents. Long story short, my grandpa has a heart problem. He's thinking about getting a full-time aide to help out. He's very stubborn as far as wanting to get one. My mom was upset about that. And what she said is basically, I will respect what he wants and I'm not going to push on it anymore. And I thought that was really interesting because it was like almost an exact match to a quote from Confucius, which I'll read. The master said, in serving your parents, you may gently remonstrate with them. However, once it becomes apparent that they have not taken your criticism to heart, you should be respectful and not oppose them and follow their lead diligently without resentment. And I thought that's exactly what she did. So I think it was very fortunate that we had a Confucian example within that phone call. But obviously, very pleasant being able to show love and respect to her.
Yeah, and I think on the other hand, on my side, it was a bit of a mess. When I first called my dad, I said hello and he didn't say anything, so I got confused. And then I called him again, and then I tried to show him respect and, do what we had planned. However, my dad ended up going on a spiel about Christianity since he is a pastor. So I think that was super interesting. But I think at the end of the day, especially like this portion, I think it was just nice to be able to express how I feel towards my parents because they are the ones who've given me like everything that I have, and they're the ones who've made me. And I think it's just interesting because like in my culture particularly, there's not a lot of expression of like, oh, I love you or blah, blah, blah. It's usually done through action, but I think there is something to like actually saying it and making that like a routine and doing that even daily. I think that's super like interesting.
And then with respect to appreciation of music, we listened to Holy Night, which is a song that we both love and hold dear in our hearts. I thought it was a really great experience, partly because I don't usually take the time out of my day to block out, some amount of time just to listen. I usually listen to music in the background while I'm doing something else or while I'm working out, or whatever it might be. But just to sit, listen to the words, the lyrics, appreciate it, and then sort of what Confucius describes as this harmony. where you start out at the song with all these different notes and variety, and then you reach this point of harmony, and I did feel like we reached that. And emotionally as well, I feel like you kind of take that journey along with the song, so really just peaceful and enjoyable part of the day.
Yeah, no, I also agree with that. I think there's like definitely a story to the song and definitely a huge climax in the song. So I think I was also really grateful that we were able to just stop and listen. I think especially in the life of like a Harvard student, it's really easy to just keep being busy instead of like stopping and being like still and just resting and like understanding like and appreciating something. And then one of the little things that I did was like an act of goodness, which was cleaning the room.
I appreciate it.
I think a quote that like really goes with this is, I can't say this word.
Conscientious.
I
got you.
And trustworthy. She should display general care for the masses, but feel a particular affection for those who are good. So I guess like in this case you have me doing the act of goodness and then George receiving that act of goodness.
Again, I appreciate it. My room is actually spotless right now. So.
And I think for me it was just like nice to know that like, hey, I'm doing something that will make a positive impact on someone else, and it feels good to do things like that. And yeah. And then lastly, we can just talk about like all the intellectual things that we did. So we actually spent a good chunk of time actually just studying the intellectual activity. So I studied like climate change, focused in like Europe because I thought that was really interesting, and how it like affects other people. And then George, you did crypto, right?
Yep, correct.
Yeah, and like crypto's like a huge thing now and affects a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
In markets, right?
Yeah, of course.
And then we also had like this conversation about human nature. I think this again like goes back to like the first quote that we talked about, which was if you learn about thinking about what you have learned, you will be lost. So I think it was really interesting to like be able to have set time where you're like doing a activity that like no one is like making you do.
Yeah, well, I think so much of it is like, again, like actively taking the time to block time out of your day to intentionally do something. I think we do a lot of things without intent. We do them based on instinct, and part of the daily routine that really guided us in the direction we were supposed to be going was everything on there was intentional because we took the time to sit down and think about what am I doing and why am I doing it. So that was really valuable.
Yeah, a lot about like creating space, especially with like having that time of intellectual conversation. I think a lot of times people late at night can have that, but I think it's really valuable to like intentionally put that in a schedule.
And so I guess at this point for Confucius, to try to tie it all together, as far as like how effective this philosophy was for helping us find purpose, you can say what you think as well, but for myself, I really thought it was pretty effective. The biggest thing for me was I felt like I escaped my instincts and put intent in place of those instincts. And then when I think about like sort of how Confucius thinks through what it means to live a purposeful and meaningful life, a good life, as we conceptually call it, there's a great quote, which is, merely set your heart sincerely upon goodness, and you'll be free of bad intentions. And as I understand it, goodness in Confucius' mind comes from virtue. So if we are to live a virtuous life, we will live a good life and therefore a happy life. And then when I think about what virtue is, according to Confucius, that seems to be predicated on learning, respect, really moral behavior and character, things like showing respect for your elders, etc. And all of those things seem to not necessarily be instinctual to us. These seem to be things that we actively need to work on through routine and self-cultivation. And so if we know that happiness comes from goodness, and goodness comes from virtue, and virtue comes from all these practices, like I think that's where having routine and very intentional action comes in play.
Yeah, and I definitely like felt the same way, because like these are things I wouldn't like necessarily do unless I was given the opportunity, but being put using like like having intentions to do so actually I think changed a lot of things and actually made me think more about like how I should be living my life, and like, you know, like why should I even call my parents every day? And I think like that's super important things to like yeah, I know. Like a super important thing to do because they're like precious people in my life. So I really enjoyed like this type of like day, and it really did help find like purpose, because a lot of times you're like, why am I doing this? And it's like, oh, there's so many good reasons for why you should do it.
Yeah, and it's like Confucius says, once the roots are established, the way will grow. So I feel like we've really started to set up the roots at this point, and hopefully we'll continue to move in the direction of the way. So that's the reflection on Confucius. We're going to talk about Lord Shang now.
Hi, we're back with our second reflection. So we're reflecting on our second episode, which is based on the world of Lord Shang, and we played 2 games to try to simulate what it would feel like to be in a world of Lord Shang. And basically, in our first game, we were trying to really simulate single-mindedness and how to like have razor sharp focus on producing agriculture as well as preparations for war, because the premise of the game was you would be able to play a move, but you would also have another state that would be able to attack you with anything. So it could be like stealing your food, or taking away your safety, or making you listen to music, or making you learn something, which music and learning was just frowned upon by Lord Shang because he really wanted people to be single-minded. And I think that game was particularly interesting because as people, like me and George are both people who have been growing up in a very complex society, and we've been able to have like, free mind to think about whatever we want to learn whatever we wanted, to listen to whatever we want to, and we haven't been restricted in that sense. So I think like the game ultimately really fell apart because we weren't razor sharp focused on producing food and protecting ourselves. So that was kind of the first game, and how, being single-minded is particularly hard, but that was what Lord Shang believed to be like the best way to make sure that people were surviving, and especially in those boring states periods. And then the second game was a little bit different, and I'll have George explain it.
Yeah, so the second game, which we called Crime and Punishment, I think was really exploring this idea of what Lord Shang describes as a natural equilibrium in a state of non-action. So he kind of conceives this self-actualizing structure whereby people in society will eventually not commit crimes because they know that there are punishments, not necessarily because they're being punished. And so in the structure of the game, very similar to game 1, people have the option to effectively be a good citizen or skirt the law and do things like learn and listen to music, which would be punishable. And so it was a 10-round game. I think the idea was, let's see how punishment actually affects play relative to utility maximization, which was the goal of the game, to maximize your own utility. And so it's kind of like humans have this natural tendency to want more, to desire more, and Lord Shang references that in the text, which is to say the desire of people for riches and honor does not generally cease before their coffins are closed. So he's very much aware of this desire to want more, and that's why the punishments are in place. However, I would say the knowledge that we may not be caught really pushed us to continue to commit crimes and try to game the system. And I thought what was perhaps the most interesting takeaway was that even after Iris had won the game, so I had been caught, but even after Iris had won the game, she actually continued to skirt the law and to continue to try to learn and listen to music, even though those things were forbidden, and she'd already hit really high level of utility. So I thought about why that is, and I actually connected to something that Confucius said, which is, if you try to guide the common people with coercive regulations and keep them in line with punishments, the common people will become evasive and will have no sense of shame. And I feel like that's kind of exactly what happened in this case. It was like, the law becomes your enemy to a degree. You're fighting law, you're trying to skirt the law, you resent the law, and I think that is ultimately the problem. So, personally, my experience with Lord Shang and this society is that the really effective lack of democratic action, I think, is quite difficult to stomach, especially because of the culture that we come from now and what our expectation is. But like single-mindedness that came out in game one, and then resentment that came out in game two, I think made, honestly, this quite miserable. Even though it was only a simulation, you could kind of imagine why you would have minimal meaning or purpose in your life. Really seems restrictive, and to be honest, relative to the way we lived as Confucians, I felt devoid of meaning.
Yeah, I think back to like your point about like how I kept breaking the law even after you had broken it. Like, I think it just again goes to show like it is hard to be single-minded when you're coming from some place where you're not single-mindedness, which I think is why I wasn't the best Lord Shang citizen. Because I think like Lord Shang would actually argue that punishment is like heavy punishments are necessary, which is why like they cut off each other's nose or whatever.
Yeah. And if we go back to video one as well, just last thing I'll say about this is, I think what made the days of Confucian very meaningful for us was this idea of intent behind our actions. But in the case of Lord Shang's society, it honestly feels like citizens are a cog in the machine that are building towards this greater society, but not necessarily understanding the intent behind their actions. Sort of like, produce more food. That's it. That's your role, and you kind of have to deal with it. So I feel like that lack of intent in action was really the difference between day one and day two.
Yeah, and so I guess like for like just to be very explicit, for like the effectiveness of finding purpose, did not really find purpose in this. In fact, I was kind of like, I would not want to live in this society and probably would not be trying this again since a bit too yeah.
Okay, so the last philosophy that we explored was that of Mozi, and again, exploring the question of whether or not this would add meaning and purpose to our lives. I think I was relatively surprised overall. I feel like throughout the course of the class, I don't know, a lot of people seem to view Mozi in a fairly negative light, I would say, relative to Confucius or Mencius. However, the two ideas that we explored in this day in the life of a disciple of Mozi, I thought were really quite interesting and effective. And so the first was this idea of impartial caring, and the second was this idea of moderation and elimination of waste in our lives. So talk about impartial caring first. This was really something that forced us to step out of, I think, what we're used to and what we're comfortable with. We went to a website that we hadn't heard of before, World Vision, and then we picked a young boy that we had never heard of before that was seemingly in need of assistance. And honestly, it was kind of eye-opening that, one, we could help in the way that we did and didn't necessarily think to do that on our own accord. And two, like, to really think about the social structures that we have in place, like communities and local groups and families, and why we do kind of pigeonhole ourselves into these structures when there are all different types of things going on in the world. And so, as Mozi says, if people regard other people's states in the same way that they regard their own, who then would incite their own state to attack that of another? And I really do think this is extremely relevant when you think about one of the first things you said in the introduction was lack of social connectedness and also division in today's society. And I feel like so much of that comes to this idea of impartial caring relative to partial caring. It's like, think about it, even politically, right? We care for the perspectives within our own party, but not those on the other side of the aisle, et cetera, et cetera. I feel like this idea of thinking impartially is actually really relevant, and I thought it was eye-opening for me. And then I do think it connects directly to this idea of moderation, if you want to touch on that.
Yeah, no, I thought that was very interesting because, like, the things that we picked to not do, which was spend our money excessively. So basically we're eliminating Starbucks from our lives, as well as just buying extra food, since we really hate HUDs, but it's okay. HUDs is fine. And then as well as just not listening to music. So I think it was really interesting about how like the way we spend our money and the way we don't waste it could be like utilized in a different way where we can actually support more people. For example, like the money that we don't spend on Starbucks, the money we don't spend on food can go like more to like Jefferson Paul and also like his community to make a better and more positive impact. I think a quote that like really exemplifies this is, if one could eliminate the fondness that kings, dukes, and great officials have for accumulating quantities of pearls and jades, birds and beasts, and dogs and horses, and use this revenue to increase the availability of clothes, houses, armor, shields, weapons, boats, and vehicles, could one double the number of these? So basically just thinking about like, if we didn't pursue like whatever we want, but we, did everything in moderation, how much more could we help other people? And I think that goes back to the idea of impartial caring. And I think like it was pretty enlightening to like live a day like this and to be able to like avoid our temptations and not give into it and actually do something that helps other people and not ourselves. So like not feeding yourself, but feeding other people and making a better impact.
So overall, I would say this one was perhaps most effective in my eyes. I think it was close between this and the Confucian way of living a day, but I enjoyed this one.
Yeah, I think like if you think about like what kind of impact do you want to make, like do you want to make more personal impact or more like impact on other people? I do think like this one was the best way of like being able to help other people, like especially like just through our money and how we spend it. So, and I think there's obviously more ways that we could do this, and we'll just have to like think more about that. But overall, I think it was much better than Lord Shang's.
So, fun project. Thank you guys for listening. Like, comment, and subscribe, and yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the series.
Yeah.